Conflict and redemption. The Mafia son who tried to break free from his father's legacy, 1985-300. The weight of blood. The rain hammered against the windows of the Torino family mansion like bullets against armor. Each drop a reminder of the violence that had built these. Michael Torino stood in his father's study, watching the water streak down the glass, distorting the view of their sprawling estate in Queens. At 25, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from growing up in a world where respect was earned through fear. But tonight, something felt different. "You're thinking too much again, Mickey," came the gravelly voice from behind the mahogany desk. Vincent "Vinny the Hammer" Torino didn't look up from the ledger. He was reviewing, his thick fingers moving across columns of numbers that represented more than just money. They represented power, territory, and the lifeblood of one of New York's most feared crime families. Michael turned from the window, his reflection catching in the glass for a moment. He saw his father's eyes staring back at him, the same steel-gray color that had intimidated countless men into submission. But where Vincent's gaze held the cold calculation of a predator, Michael's carried something else: doubt. "Pop, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Vincent finally looked up, setting down his gold-plated pen with deliberate precision. The study fell silent, except for the rain and the distant hum of the city that never slept. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that had never been read, their spines as pristine as the day they were placed there, a facade of respectability in a world built on anything but talk. "We're talking now, ain't we?" Vincent leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his considerable weight. At 58, he was still an imposing figure, his broad shoulders filling out his tailored suit like a boxer who had never quite left the ring. Michael approached the desk, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rug that had cost more than most people made in a year. He'd walked across this rug countless times as a child, summoned to receive praise for good grades or punishment for disappointing his father. Tonight felt like both. "The Castellano situation," Michael began, referring to the recent territorial dispute that had erupted into violence on the streets of Brooklyn. "There has to be another way." Vincent's expression didn't change, but Michael caught the slight tightening around his eyes, a tale he'd learned to read over the years. "Another way? Kid, there's only one way in this business. You show strength or you show weakness. Ain't no middle ground. 3 men are dead, Pop. 3 families without fathers. 3 men who forgot their place," Vincent corrected, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You think this is a game, Mickey? You think we're playing by the same rules as those suits on Wall Street?" Michael had heard the speech before, variations of it echoing through his childhood like a broken record. The family business wasn't just about money, it was about respect, tradition, and the unbreakable bonds of blood. But tonight, those bonds felt more like chains. Are you fascinated by stories of family loyalty and moral conflicts? Subscribe to our newsletter for more gripping tales of crime, redemption, and the price of breaking free from the past. "I know what this is," Michael said, his voice growing stronger. "But I also know what it's cost us." "What it's cost you?" For the first time in the conversation, Vincent's mask slipped. A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment, Michael saw not the feared Don of the Torino family, but a man who had buried too many friends and made too many enemies to ever sleep peacefully. "Cost me?" Vincent stood, slowly, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the desk. "This life has given us everything. This house, your education, the respect of every man from here to Sicily. You think that comes free?" Michael met his father's gaze without flinching. "And what about Maria?" The name hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Maria Torino, Vincent's wife and Michael's mother, had died 3 years ago, not from illness or accident, but from a car bomb meant for Vincent. The official story was that she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but Michael knew the truth. In their world, there were no innocent victims, only casualties of war. Vincent's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Michael thought his father might strike him. Instead, the older man walked to the window, his reflection joining Michael's in the rain-streaked glass. "Your mother understood the life," Vincent said quietly. "She knew the risks. She didn't choose them." Michael replied, "We did. You did." The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken grief and growing resentment. Outside, the storm was intensifying, and Michael couldn't help but see it as an omen of what was coming. "I've been thinking about college," Michael said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Colombia has a good business program. Legitimate business." Vincent turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "You want to go to school? Fine. Learn about business. But don't forget where you come from. And don't forget what you owe this family." Michael nodded, but inside, he was already planning his escape. He had no way of knowing that his father was planning something entirely different, something that would test the bonds of blood and loyalty in ways neither of them could imagine. As the storm raged outside, father and son stood in the study, separated by more than just the mahogany desk between them. They were separated by two different visions of what it meant to be a Torino, and only one of them could survive. Columbia University in 1985 was a world away from the smoke-filled backrooms and whispered conversations of Michael's childhood. The ivy-covered buildings and tree-lined walkways represented everything his father's world was not: legitimate, respectable, and clean. For the first time in his life, Michael could walk into a room without people knowing his last name, without the weight of reputation preceding him like a shadow. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell's business ethics class was held in a lecture hall that could seat 200 students, but Michael always chose a seat in the back corner, away from the clusters of eager undergraduates who seemed to view the world through rose-colored glasses. At 26, he was older than most of his classmates, and the experiences that had shaped him were darker than anything they could imagine. "Can anyone tell me the difference between legal and ethical?" Professor Hartwell asked, her voice carrying easily across the amphitheater-style seating. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and diligent eyes that seemed to see through the facades that most people wore. Hands held up around the room, and Michael listened to the predictable answers about moral obligations and societal standards. These kids had grown up in a world where right and wrong were clearly defined, where the good guys wore white hats and the bad guys always got their comeuppance in the end. "Mr. Torino," Professor Hartwell's voice cut through his thoughts. "You've been quiet today. What's your perspective?" Michael felt the familiar weight of attention setting on him. In his father's world, being noticed could be dangerous. Here it was just uncomfortable. "I think," Michael began slowly, "that the line between legal and ethical isn't as clear as we'd like it to be. Sometimes the law protects people who don't deserve protection, and sometimes it punishes people who are just trying to survive." The classroom fell silent, and Michael could feel the curious stares of his classmates. Professor Hartwell leaned against her desk, studying him with renewed interest. "That's a rather cynical view for someone your age," she observed. "Care to elaborate?" Michael hesitated. How could you explain that he'd grown up in a world where the police were often more corrupt than the criminals they were supposed to catch, where judges could be bought and prosecutors could be intimidated, where the only law that mattered was the law of the street? "I just think that sometimes the system fails people," he said finally, "and when it does, they have to find other ways to protect themselves and their families." After class, Professor Hartwell approached him as he was packing his books. "Mr. Torino, could I speak with you for a moment?" Michael tensed, wondering if somehow his cover had been blown. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw only curiosity and concern. "Your insights in class are unusual," she said carefully. "You speak like someone who's seen more of the world than most students your age. I'm wondering if you might be interested in some additional reading on moral philosophy, particularly the works of philosophers who've grappled with questions of justice and imperfect systems." Michael found himself nodding before he could stop himself. "I'd like that." As he walked across campus that evening, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time, he was being valued for his mind rather than his name, for his thoughts rather than his potential for violence. But that hope was shattered when he returned to his off-campus apartment and found Tony Castellano waiting for him. Tony was Vincent's lieutenant, a man whose loyalty to the family was matched only by his capacity for brutality. He sat in Michael's living room as if he owned it, his expensive suit at odds with the modest furnishings of a college student's apartment. "Mickey," Tony said, not bothering to stand, "your old man wants to see you." "I'm in the middle of midterms," Michael replied, setting his backpack down carefully. "Can't it wait?" Tony's laugh was like broken glass. "You think this is a request? You think because you're playing college boy, you ain't still family?" The drive back to Queens was conducted in silence, but Michael's mind was racing. He'd been careful to keep his two worlds separate, but clearly that separation was an illusion. His father's reach extended everywhere, even into the hallowed halls of academia. Want to discover more stories about the struggle between duty and desire? Join thousands of readers who follow our weekly crime fiction series for tales that explore the darkest corners of human nature. The family compound looked the same as always, imposing, isolated, and surrounded by the kind of security that money could buy, but peace of mind could not. Vincent was waiting in the same study where they'd had their last conversation, but this time he wasn't alone. Salvatore Sali the Fish, Marconi, sat across from Vincent's desk, his thin frame draped in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Sali was the underboss of a rival family, and his presence in the Torino house could mean only one thing: war or alliance. "Mickey," Vincente said, without looking up from the documents spread across his desk. "Good, you're here. We got business to discuss." Michael remained standing, his college textbook still clutched in his hands like a shield against the world he was being pulled back into. "The Marconi family, as a proposition," Vincent continued. "A joint venture that could be very profitable for both our organizations." Sally smiled, revealing teeth that had been capped with gold. "Your boy's got a good head for numbers, I hear. College education and all that. We could use someone with his credentials." Michael felt the walls of his carefully constructed new life closing in around him. "What kind of proposition?" "Money laundering," Vincent said matter-of-factly. "Sally's got connections in the Cayman Islands, and we got connections in legitimate businesses. Your job would be to make sure the books look clean. You want me to be an accountant for the mob?" Michael said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I want you to be what you were born to be," Vincent replied, his voice carrying a warning. "A Torino." Michael looked between his father and Sally, seeing his future mapped out in their expectant faces. He could play along, use his education to help them hide their crimes, and eventually take his place as Vincent's heir. Or he could refuse and face the consequences of betraying the family that had given him everything. "I need time to think about it," Michael said finally. Vincent's expression darkened. "Time? Mickey, this ain't a career counseling session. This is family business." "Then give me until tomorrow," Michael pressed. "One night to figure out how to make this work with my class schedule." Sally laughed, but Vincent studied his son with calculating eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "But Mickey, don't make me wait too long. In this business, hesitation can be fatal." As Michael drove back to his apartment, he knew that he was standing at a crossroads. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between the life he was born into and the life he was trying to build. And for the first time since he'd started college, he wasn't sure which choice would destroy him more completely. The rain had started again, and as Michael watched the water streak across his windshield, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Michael was sitting in his apartment, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to his cousin Frankie, and the panic in his tone was unmistakable. "Mickey, You gotta get down here. Now, what happened? It's your father. There was a shooting. The drive to Mount Sinai Hospital passed in a blur of sirens and racing thoughts. Michael found himself praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, bargaining with the universe for his father's life, even as he questioned everything Vincent Torino stood for. The Hospital Cecil was a starlit maze of beeping machines and antiseptic smells that seemed to mock the violence that had brought them there. Vincent lay unconscious in a bed, surrounded by more technology than Michael had ever seen, his powerful frame reduced to something fragile and vulnerable. 3 bullets, Dr. Saracen explained. Her voice professional but not unkind. 2 in the chest, 1 in the shoulder. He's stable for now, but the next 24 hours are critical. Michael nodded, but the words seemed to come from a great distance. Around him, the family was gathering, uncles, cousins, and associates who had built their lives around Vincent's strength and leadership. Without him, they were rudderless, and Michael could see the fear in their eyes. Who did this? Michael asked Tony Castellano, who had appointed himself as the family's temporary spokesman. We're still putting the pieces together, Tony replied, but his eyes said more than his words. Could be the Marconis, could be the feds trying to send a message, could be anyone. But Michael knew better. In their world, violence was never random. Someone had made a calculated decision to try to kill Vincent Torino, and that someone had a reason. Gripped by this tale of family loyalty and betrayal. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe to our exclusive crime fiction updates and be the first to read what happens next. The answer came that evening. Delivered by an unlikely messenger, Professor Elizabeth Hartwell appeared in the hospital waiting room like an apparition from another world, her academic composure at odds with the barely controlled chaos surrounding her. Mr. Reno, she said quietly, approaching Michael with the careful movements of someone entering a lion's den. I heard about your father. I'm sorry. Michael stared at her, wondering how she had found him, how she even knew who his father was. The look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. You're not just a professor, are you? He said. She glanced around the waiting room, taking in the collection of men in expensive suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a Scorsese film. Could we speak privately? They found an empty conference room down the hall, and Professor Hartwell, or whoever she really was, closed the door behind them with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to clandestine meetings. My name is Elizabeth Hartwell, she began, and I am a professor at Columbia. But I'm also Special Agent Elizabeth Hartwell, F. Betsy Bye. Michael felt a grind shift beneath him. How long have you known? About you, from the day you enrolled, about your father's business? We've been building a case against the Torino family for 3 years. And you've been watching me. We've been hoping, she corrected, hoping that you might be different, that you might want something better than the life your father chose. Michael laughed, but there was no more in it. So this is what? A recruitment pitch? You want me to turn on my family? I want you to help us stop the violence, Agent Hartwell said. Your father's organization is responsible for dozens of deaths, millions of dollars in illegal activity, and the corruption of countless public officials. But more than that, it's destroying communities, destroying families. Like mine? Yes, she said simply. Like yours. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling between them. Michael thought about the conversations they'd had in class, the books she'd recommended, the way she'd challenged him to think about ethics and morality. Had it all been a lie? A shooting, Michael said suddenly. You know who did it? Agent Hartwell's expression confirmed his suspicion. We believe it was ordered by Salvatore Marconi. Our intelligence suggests that the joint venture your father was considering was actually a setup, a way for Marconi to eliminate a rival while making it look like a business deal gone wrong. You were listening. We have surveillance on your father's house, yes. We know about the meeting, about the proposition they made to you. Michael felt a cold rage building in his chest. Not just at Marconi for trying to kill his father, but at the FBI for watching it happen, for using him as an unwitting pawn in their investigation. If you knew it was a trap, why didn't you warn him? Because we needed proof of Marconi's intentions, and because she hesitated. Because we hoped that if something happened to your father, you might finally be willing to help us. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. The FBI had been willing to let his father die to advance their case. They had used his education, his desire for a better life, as leverage in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Get out, he said quietly. Michael, please. Think about what I'm offering you. A chance to break free from this cycle, to build a legitimate life without looking over your shoulder. I said, get out. Agent Hartwell reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. When you're ready to talk, and you will be ready eventually, call me. But don't wait too long. The window for cooperation won't stay open forever. After she left, Michael sat alone in the conference room, staring at the card in his hand. On one side was her contact information. On the other was a future. He had never imagined a life as an informant, a betrayer of everything he had been raised to believe in. But as he thought about his father lying unconscious down the hall, about his mother's death 3 years ago, about the endless cycle of violence that had defined his family for generations, he began to wonder if betrayal might be the only path to redemption. The choice he had been avoiding was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he had ever loved. Vincent Torino woke up 3 days later to find his son sitting beside his hospital bed, reading a book on moral philosophy. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Nietzsche? Vincent asked, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. Kant, Michael corrected, closing the book. Professor Hartwell recommended it. Vincent's eyes sharpened, despite the pain medication. In their world, details matter. And the fact that Michael was reading philosophy while his father fought for his life spoke volumes about where his loyalties lay. How are you feeling? Michael asked. Like I got shot 3 times, Vincent replied, attempting to sit up and immediately regretting it. But I'm alive, which is more than Marconi was counting on. You know it was him? I know a lot of things, Mickey. Question is, what do you know? Michael set the book aside and leaned forward in his chair. The conversation he'd been dreading was finally here, and there was no way to avoid it. I know that Professor Hartwell is FBI, he said. I know they've been watching us for 3 years, and I know they want me to cooperate with their investigation. Vincent's expression didn't change, but Michael could see the wheels turning behind his father's eyes. In the Torino family, information was currency, and Michael had just revealed that he was holding a fortune. What did you tell them? Nothing. Yet. Yint. Repeated the word like it was a curse. You're thinking about it. Pop, look where we are. Look what this life has cost us. Mom is dead, you almost died, and for what? Money, respect, fear. For family, Vincent said, his voice growing stronger, for the knowledge that no one can touch us, that we don't have to bow down to anyone. We're not untouchable, Michael replied. We're just better at hiding the damage. Vincent stirred his son with the calculating gaze that had served him well in decades of negotiations and conflicts. The feds make you an offer, witness protection, a new identity, a chance to start over. And all you have to do is destroy everything I've built. Michael met his father's star without flinching. Everything you've built is already destroying itself. The question is whether I go down with it or try to save what's left of our family. This story of moral conflict and family loyalty is reaching its climax. Subscribe now to get immediate access to the conclusion and discover how Michael's choice will change everything. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Michael had never heard before. You think I don't know what this life costs? Vincent asked. You think I don't wake up every morning thinking about your mother, about the choices I made that put her in that car? Then why continue? Because once you're in, Mickey, there's no getting out. Not really. You can run, you can hide, you can change your name and move to the other side of the world, but this life follows you. The enemies you make, the debts you owe, the blood on your hands, it all follows you. The FBI can protect me. Vincent left, but he turned into a coughing fit that left him gasping. The FBI, kid, the FBI can't even protect their own witnesses half the time. You think they're gonna keep you safe from every enemy I've made in 30 years? So what's the alternative? I become you. Take over the family business and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder waiting for the next Marconi to put a bullet in my back. You become stronger than me, Vincent said. You learn from my mistakes, you build something better. There is no better version of this pop. There's only different flavors of the same poison. Vincent closed his eyes, and for a moment, Michael thought his father had fallen asleep. But when he opened them again, there was something different in his expression, something that looked almost like acceptance. Your mother, Vincent said quietly, the night before she died, she asked me to let you go. She said she could see what this life was doing to you, how it was eating away at the good parts of who you were meant to be. Michael felt his throat tighten. What did you tell her? He told her that family was everything, that blood was thicker than water, that a man who abandons his family abandons himself. Vincent paused, staring at the ceiling. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is let them go. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of the hospital. Michael had expected anger, threats, maybe even violence when he revealed what he knew. He hadn't expected this, his father's quiet acknowledgement that the life they had built was unsustainable. If I do this, Michael said carefully, if I cooperate with the FBI, what happens to you? I go to prison, Vincent replied matter-of-factly. Maybe for the rest of my life, but you get to leave. Really leave, not just survive. I can't do that to you. You can, and you will, Vincent said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect for decades, because that's what sons do. They become better than their fathers. Michael felt tears, threatening, and he looked away, focusing on the window where the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the hospital room. Outside, the world continued its relentless motion, indifferent to the drama playing out in this sterile space. There's something else, Vincent, his voice barely above a whisper. Something I never told you about your mother's death. Michael turned back to his father, dreading what he was about to hear. It wasn't random, Vincent continued. The bomb wasn't meant for me. It was meant for both of us. Marconi wanted to send a message, to show that no one in the Torino family was safe. Your mother died because she was my wife, but she was targeted because she was your mother. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. His mother hadn't been collateral damage in his father's war. She had been a deliberate target, killed to hurt both Vincent and Michael. Why? Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand what you're up against, Vincent said. These people, the Marconis, the other families, they don't play by rules. They don't respect innocence or neutrality. If you're going to break free from this life, you need to do it completely. No half measures, no looking back. Michael nodded, understanding, finally dawning. His father wasn't just giving him permission to cooperate with the FBI. He was ordering him to do it as a final act of paternal protection. When? Michael asked. Tonight, Vincent replied. Before Marconi figures out that I'm going to survive and decides to finish the job. As the sun set over Queens, Michael Torino prepared to make the choice that would define the rest of his life. He was about to betray everything he had been raised to believe in, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally doing the right thing. The FBI safe house in Westchester looked like any other suburban home, white picket fence, manicured lawn, and the kind of normalcy that Michael had never experienced. Ken Hartwell led him through the front door at 2 a.m., past federal agents who tried to look casual while maintaining constant vigilance. Coffee, she offered, as if they were meeting for a social reset rather than the systematic dismantling of one of New York's most powerful crime families. Michael shook his head, his mind still reeling from the conversation with his father. 12 hours ago, he had been a college student trying to escape his family's legacy. Now he was about to become the key witness in a federal investigation that would destroy everything he had ever known. "Before we begin," Agent Hartwell said, settling into a chair across from him, "I need you to understand what you're committing to. This isn't just about testifying against your father's organization. Once you start down this path, there's no going back. My father already explained that to me." "Did they? Because I'm not sure you fully grasp what this means. Your testimony will likely result in the conviction of dozens of people, not just your father, but uncles, cousins, family, friends, people who've known you since you were a child." Michael thought about Tony Castellano, who had taught him how to throw a punch when he was 10. About his uncle Sal, who had never missed one of his birthday parties. About the extended network of loyalty and obligation that had defined his entire world. "They made their choices," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "And now you're making yours." The debriefing lasted 18 hours, broken only by brief meals and bathroom breaks. Agent Hartwell was joined by a rotating cast of federal prosecutors, accountants, and investigators, each focused on a different aspect of the Torino family's operations. Michael found himself recounting conversations he'd overheard as a child, explaining the significance of seemingly innocent family gatherings and providing details about financial transactions he'd witnessed, but never fully understood. The money laundering operation, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen said, spreading photographs across the table. "Your father used legitimate businesses to clean money from drug sales, extortion, and illegal gambling. Can you identify any of these locations?" Michael looked at the surveillance photos, recognizing restaurants where he'd eaten Sunday dinner, construction sites where he'd watched his father conduct business, and office buildings that housed companies with names he'd memorized but never questioned. "This one," he said, pointing to a photo of a modest Italian restaurant in Little Italy. "Mama Rosa's. My father owns it through a shell corporation. The books show it serving 3 times as many customers as it actually does." "How do you know that?" "Because I've been eating there since I was 5 years old. I know how busy it gets, and I know how much money it should be making." The questions continued, each answer building a ace that would eventually topple an empire built on violence and fear. Michael provided bank account numbers, explained coded conversations, and detailed the hierarchy of command that kept the Torino family functioning. The tension is building to an explosive conclusion. Make sure you don't miss the final chapters of this gripping tale. Subscribe to our premium content for immediate access to the complete story. But it was the personal details that proved most damaging. Michael's intimate knowledge of family dynamics, his understanding of who could be trusted and who might be turned, and his ability to predict how his father's associates would react to pressure, made him an invaluable asset to the prosecution. Salvatore Marconi, Agent Hartwell said, showing him a file thick with surveillance photos and intelligence reports. "Tell us about his relationship with your father." "They've been rivals for 20 years, Michael explained. "But they've also done business together when it was profitable." The shooting wasn't just about eliminating competition, it was personal. Personal? How? Michael hesitated, knowing that what he was about to reveal would seal Marconi's fate. "My father was sleeping with Marconi's wife. It started about 6 months ago, after a meeting to discuss territorial boundaries. Marconi found out 2 weeks before the shooting." The room fell silent as the prosecutors absorbed this information. A crime of passion disguised as a business dispute would be much easier to prosecute than a complex conspiracy case. "Can you prove this?" Chen asked. "My father kept photos," Michael said quietly, "in his safe at home. He thought they were insurance, leverage to keep Marconi in line. He never imagined that Marconi would be willing to risk everything for revenge." As the debriefing continued into its second day, Michael began to understand the full scope of what his corporation would accomplish. The FBI had been building cases against multiple crime families for years, but they had lacked the insider knowledge necessary to make their charges stick. Michael's testimony would provide the missing pieces, connecting seemingly unrelated crimes and revealing the true structure of organized crime in New York. But with each revelation, Michael felt a piece of his old life die. He was betraying not just his father's trust, but the code of silence that had governed his world since childhood. In the culture he'd grown up in, there was no sin greater than becoming an informant, no betrayal more complete than cooperating with law enforcement. "We'll need you to wear a wire," Agent Hartwell explained as they prepared for the next phase of the operation. "Your father is recovering, but he's still conducting business from his hospital bed. We need recordings of him giving orders, discussing ongoing criminal activities." "Hell no," Michael said. "He's been in this business too long not to spot surveillance. Not if you're careful. Not if you give him a reason to trust you completely." Michael understood what she was asking. He would have to convince his father that he had decided against cooperation, that family loyalty had won out over his moral qualms. He would have to lie to the man who had just given him permission to destroy everything they had built together. "There's something else," Agent Hartwell continued. "We have intelligence that Marconi is planning another attempt on your father's life. If we're going to prevent it, we need to move quickly." "When?" "Tomorrow night. Marconi's people have identified a weakness in hospital security. They're planning to finish what they started." Michael felt the walls closing in around him. His father's life hung in the balance, dependent on Michael's ability to gather evidence while maintaining his cover. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and Vincent Torino would die, not from Marconi's bullets, but from his son's betrayal. As he prepared to return to the hospital, Michael carried with him the weight of impossible choices. He was about to save his father's life by destroying it, to protect his family by betraying it, to honor his mother's memory by ensuring that her husband would spend his remaining years in federal prison. The wire felt cold against his chest as he walked through the hospital corridors, past the federal agents disguised as orderlies and visitors. In a few hours, he would sit beside his father's bed and record the conversations that would end the Torino family's reign of power. But first, he had to figure out how to live with himself afterward. The hospital room felt different when Michael returned that evening. Vincent was sitting up in bed, looking stronger despite the bandages and ERV lines that still connected him to various machines. But it was the man sitting in the corner chair that made Michael's blood run cold. Salvatore Marconi rose as Michael entered, his thin frame unfolding with predatory grace. He was alone, which meant either supreme confidence or desperation in their world. Both could be equally dangerous. "Mickey," Marconi said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. "Good to see you, kid. Your old man and I were just having a conversation about the future." Michael's hand instinctively moved toward the wire hidden beneath his shirt, but he forced himself to remain calm. The FBI prepared him for this possibility, but facing Marconi in person, the man who had tried to kill his father and succeeded in killing his mother, was testing every ounce of self-control he possessed. "Sally," Michael acknowledged, his voice neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here. Where else would I be?" Marconi replied, "Your father and I have been friends for 30 years. When I heard about the shooting, I had to come pay my respects." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Marconi was standing in the hospital room of the man he had tried to murder, expressing concern for his recovery. But Vincent seemed unsurprised by the visit, which meant this meeting had been planned. "Sit down, Mickey," Vincent said, his voice carrying the authority that still commanded respect despite his weakened condition. "Sally has a proposition for us." Michael took the chair beside his father's bed, positioning himself so that the wire would pick up both men's voices clearly. Whatever was about to happen, the FBI would have a record of it. "The shooting," Marconi began, settling back into his chair, "was a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. My people were targeting a rival family's lieutenant, and your father got caught in the crossfire." It was a lie so transparent that Michael wondered if Marconi actually expected them to believe it. But Vincent nodded as if the explanation made perfect sense. These things happen, Vincent said. In our business, violence is always a risk. Exactly, Marconi agreed. Which is why I'm here to make amends, to propose a partnership that will benefit both our families and reduce the risk of future misunderstandings. Michael listened as Marconi outlined his plan, a merger of sorts between the two families with shared territories and combined resources. It sounded reasonably on the surface, but Michael could see the trap hidden beneath the diplomatic language. Marconi was trying to absorb the Torino family's operations while Vincent was weakened, using the shooting as cover for a hostile takeover. What's my role in this partnership? Michael asked, knowing that his participation was crucial to Marconi's plan. You're the future, Marconi replied. Educated, sophisticated, able to move in legitimate circles. With your help, we can expand into new markets, new opportunities. And if I refuse? Marconi's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. Why would you refuse? This is a chance to honor your father's legacy while building something even greater. The final confrontation is about to unfold. Don't miss the explosive conclusion. Subscribe now to read the complete ending and discover how Michael's choice will determine everyone's fate. Vincent had remained silent during this exchange, but now he leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on his son's face. Mickey said quietly, "What do you think?" This was the moment Michael had been dreading. His father was giving him one last chance to choose family loyalty or moral conviction, the life he was born into or the life he was trying to build. "I think," Michael said slowly, "that Mr. Marconi is right about one thing. This is about the future." He reached into his jacket pocket, and both older men tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. But instead of a gun, Michael pulled out a small recording device, not the FBI wire, but a personal recorder he had brought with him. "I've been recording this conversation," he announced, setting the device on the bedside table. "Everything you've said about the shooting, about the partnership, about your plans for the future." Marconi's face went white. "You little—" "Shut up, Sally," Vincent interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Let the boy finish." Michael looked at his father, seeing pride and sadness warring in the older man's eyes. "I'm not going to be part of this world anymore, Pop. I can't, but I'm also not going to let it destroy what's left of our family." He turned to Marconi, his voice growing stronger. "You killed my mother. You tried to kill my father. And now you want me to shake your hand and pretend we're partners? You got no proof." "I have your confession," Michael said, gesturing to the recorder. "And I have something else." He pulled out his phone and played a recording. Marconi's voice, captured during a conversation with one of his lieutenants, discussing the details of the hospital attack plan for that night. "The FBI gave me this," Michael explained. "They've been watching you for months, waiting for enough evidence to move against you. This conversation, combined with your admission about the shooting, should be more than enough." Marconi lunged for the recording device, but Vincent was faster despite his injury. The older man's hand shot out, grabbing Marconi's wrist with surprising strength. "You always were too eager, Sally," Vincent said, "too willing to let emotion override strategy. You set me up." Marconi snarled, trying to pull free from Vincent's grip. "My son set you up," Vincent corrected. "He just gave him the opportunity." The door burst open as FBI agents flooded the room, their weapons drawn, and voices shouting commands. Marconi was on the ground in seconds, his hands cuffed behind his back as Agent Hartwell read him his rights. As the chaos subsided, Michael found himself alone with his father once again. Vincent looked exhausted, the brief burst of energy having drained what little strength he had recovered. "You knew," Michael said. "You knew I was working with the FBI." "I suspected," Vincent replied. "And when Marconi called to arrange this meeting, I was certain. He was too eager, too confident. It meant he thought he had leverage over us. So you used me as bait. I used you as my son," Vincent corrected. "He trusted you to do what was right, even if it meant destroying everything I've built." Michael felt tears threatening again. But this time he didn't look away. "What happens now? Now you live," Vincent said simply. "You finish school. You build a legitimate life, and you forget about all of this. And you..." Vincent smiled, and for a moment, Michael saw the man his father might have been in a different world, under different circumstances. "I faced the consequences of my choices," Vincent said, "just like every man should." As federal agents prepared to transfer Vincent to a secure facility, father and son shared one last moment together. The weight of 30 years of violence and betrayal hung between them. But so did something else: love, forgiveness, and the hope that redemption was possible, even for those who seemed beyond saving. "Take care of yourself, Mickey," Vincent said as the agents helped him into a wheelchair. "You too, Pop." It was the last conversation they would ever have as free men, but it was also the first honest conversation they had shared in years. As Michael watched his father being wheeled away, he knew that he had finally broken free from the cycle of violence that had defined his family for generations. The price of that freedom would be measured in years of guilt, sleepless nights, and the constant knowledge that he had chosen justice over loyalty. But as he walked out of the hospital and into the uncertain future that awaited him, Michael Torino felt something he hadn't experienced in years. 5 years later, Michael Torino, now Michael Torres, thanks to the Witness Protection Program, sat behind a mahogany desk that was smaller but somehow more significant than the one his father had commanded in Queen. The brass nameplate read, "Michael Torres, J.D., criminal defense attorney," and the irony wasn't lost on him. The son of a mob boss had become a lawyer, but not the kind his father might have expected. Instead of helping criminals evade justice, Michael dedicated his practice to defending those who couldn't afford adequate representation: immigrants, the poor, and the forgotten victims of a system that often valued wealth over truth. Elizabeth Harwell, now his law partner and, as of 6 months ago, his wife, entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee and a stack of case files that seemed to grow larger every day. "The Ramirez case," she said, setting one of the cups on his desk. "The prosecutor is offering a plea deal 3 years for armed robbery, instead of the 15 he's facing if we go to trial." Michael reviewed the file, a trained eye picking out inconsistencies in the police report, the questionable witness testimony, and the rushed investigation that had characterized so many cases involving defendants who couldn't afford high-priced legal representation. "What does your gut tell you?" he asked. "That Ramirez is innocent, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "But proving it will be difficult, and if we lose, he spends the next decade and a half in prison." It was the kind of decision that had defined Michael's new life, balancing the pursuit of justice against the harsh realities of a legal system that wasn't always interested in the truth. 5 years ago, he had betrayed his family to uphold the law. Now he often found himself fighting against that same law to protect the innocent. "We go to trial," he decided. "Ramirez deserves better than a plea deal for a crime he didn't commit." Elizabeth smiled, and Michael was reminded of why he had fallen in love with her. Not just because she had offered him a way out of his father's world, but because she shared his belief that redemption was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. The phone on his desk buzzed, and his secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Torres, there's a Vincent Torino here to see you. He says he's your father." Michael felt a familiar chill that came with any reminder of his past life. Vincent had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, and Michael had assumed their paths would never cross again. The fact that his father was here, in his office, meant that something had gone terribly wrong. "Send him in," Michael said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Vincent Torino entered the office, looking older and grayer than his 63 years, but his eyes still held the intelligence and authority that had made him one of New York's most feared crime bosses. He wore a simple gray suit that had seen better days, and his hands, once manicured and adorned with expensive rings, were now calloused from prison labor. "Hello, Mickey," Vincent said, using the childhood nickname that no one had spoken in 5 years. "It's Michael now," he replied, not rising from his chair. And I go by Torres. I know. Vincent looked around the office, taking in the law books, the framed diplomas, and the photographs of Michael and Elizabeth at their wedding. You've done well for yourself. What do you want, Pop? Vincent sat down in the chair across from the desk, and for a moment they were back in the study of the family mansion, father and son separated by more than just furniture. I'm dying, Vincent said without preamble. Lung cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. Michael felt the words hit him like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Because I wouldn't blame you if you weren't. I know what my choices cost you, cost us. How did you find me? I never lost track of you, Vincent admitted. Even in prison, even with the new name and the new life, I kept tabs on my son. I'm proud of what you've become. You're proud that I became everything you taught me to this piece. Vincent smiled, and it was the same sad expression Michael remembered from their last conversation in the hospital. I'm proud that you became everything I should have been. This powerful story of redemption and family legacy is nearing its emotional conclusion. Subscribe to our premium content to read the final moments and discover how Michael's journey ends. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her presence both protective and supportive. Michael, is everything all right? Elizabeth, this is Vincent Torrino, Michael said. My father. She stepped into the room with the careful composure of someone who had spent years dealing with dangerous people. Mr. Torrino, I've heard a lot about you. I'm sure you have, Vincent replied. Most of it probably true. What do you want? Michael asked again, his patience wearing thin. Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. I want to make amends. This contains information about crimes that were never solved, victims who never got justice, families who never got closure. Everything I can remember from 30 years in the life. Michael stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. Why not? Because I'm dying, and because I finally understand what you tried to tell me 5 years ago. This life, this world we built, it's poison. It destroys everything it touches, including the people we love most. And you think giving me this information will somehow balance the scale? I think it's a start, Vincent said. I can't undo the damage I've done, but maybe I can help you prevent some future damage. Michael looked at Elizabeth, seeing his own conflicted emotions reflected in her eyes. The information in that envelope could help solve dozens of cold cases, bring closure to countless families, and potentially prevent future crimes. But accepting it would mean acknowledging his father, reconnecting with a past he had spent 5 years trying to escape. There's something else, Vincent continued. Tony Castellano is getting out of prison next month. He blames you for the family's downfall, and he's not the forgiving type. Michael felt his blood run cold. Tony had been his father's most loyal lieutenant, and his hatred for informants was legendary. If he was being released, Michael's carefully constructed new life was in danger. The witness protection program, Elizabeth began. Won't be enough, Vincent interrupted. Tony has connections everywhere, and he's had 5 years to plan his revenge. But if you take this information to the FBI, if you help them build cases against the remaining family members, they might be able to keep Tony locked up on new charges. Michael understood the bargain his father was proposing. Vincent's information could save Michael's life, but only if he was willing to become an informant, once again, to betray people who had once considered him family. You're asking me to destroy what's left of the organization. I'm asking you to save yourself, Vincent replied, and maybe, in the process, save some other families from going through what we went through. Michael picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside were the secrets of a lifetime, the final confessions of a dying man who had finally found his conscience. If I do this, Michael said, we're even. No more contact, no more attempts to be part of my life. Vincent nodded, understanding the price of his son's cooperation. He wouldn't want it any other way. You built that something good here, something clean. I won't be the one to taint it. As Vincent rose to leave, he paused at the door, For what it's worth, Michael, your mother would be proud of the man you've become." After his father left, Michael sat in his office holding the envelope, weighing the choice between safety and principle, between protecting his new life and honoring his old loyalties. Elizabeth sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in silent support. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Michael looked out the window at the city sprawling below them, at the millions of people living their lives in the shadow of violence and corruption that men like his father had created. He thought about the clients he represented, the innocent people who needed someone to fight for them, and the family he hoped to build with Elizabeth. "I'm going to do what's right," he said finally, opening the envelope and beginning to read his father's final confession. 6 months later, Vincent Torino died in a federal prison hospital, alone except for the priest who administered his last rites. His death made the back pages of the New York papers a brief obituary for a man who had once commanded headlines. Michael did not attend the funeral, but he sent flowers, white roses, his mother's favorite, the card rather simply, "For the man you could have been, your son." By then, the information Vincent had provided had led to 17 new indictments, including charges that would keep Tony Castellano in prison for the rest of his life. The remaining members of the Torino crime family were either dead imprisoned or scattered to the wind. Michael Torres continued his law practice, fighting for justice in the courtrooms where his father had once corrupted it. He and Elizabeth had their first child the following year, a daughter they named Maria, after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose memory would guide her father's choices for the rest of his life. The cycle of violence that had defined the Torino family for generations was finally broken, not through violence or betrayal, but through the simple act of choosing to be better than the past. On quiet evenings, when Michael would sit in his daughter's nursery and watch her sleep, he would sometimes think about the weight of legacy, how the sins of one generation could echo through the next, and how love could be both a chain that binds and a force that liberates. He had paid the price for his redemption in guilt, isolation, and the constant knowledge that his freedom had come at the cost of his father's imprisonment. But as he looked at his daughter's innocent face, he knew that some prices were worth paying. The Torino name would die with Vincent, buried in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery. But the Torres name would live on, carried by a new generation that would never know the weight of blood money or the fear that came with a legacy built on violence. Michael had broken free from his father's world. But more importantly, he had ensured that his children would never have to make the same choice between family and conscience that had defined his own life. In the end, that was redemption enough. 10 years later, Michael Torres, now 40, stood before a packed courtroom, delivering his closing argument in a case that had captured the city's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had learned to command respect through truth rather than fear, "we are not here to judge the defendant's past, but to determine his guilt or innocence based on the evidence presented. The prosecution would have you believe that the man's history defines his character, that his family name determines his fate. But I submit to you that every person has the right to choose who they become, regardless of where they come from." The defendant was the son of a known crime boss, accused of continuing his father's criminal enterprise. As Michael spoke, he saw himself reflected in the young man's eyes, the same fear, the same desperate desire to escape a legacy he had never chosen. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty. As the courtroom erupted in celebration and protest, Michael felt the familiar satisfaction that came with knowing he had helped someone break free from the chains of their past. Later that evening, Michael returned home to the brownstone in Brooklyn Heights that he shared with Elizabeth and their 3 children. Maria, now 9, was helping her younger brother David with his homework, while baby Catherine slept in her crib upstairs. "How did it go?" Elizabeth asked, greeting him with a kiss that still made his heart race after 10 years of marriage. "We won," he said simply, but she could see the deeper satisfaction in his eyes. Another lost soul saved, another family given a second chance. As they sat down to dinner, Maria looked up from her plate with the serious expression that reminded Michael so much of his mother. "Daddy," she said, "Tommy at school says his dad knows who you really are. He says you used to be in the Mafia." Michael felt Elizabeth's hand squeeze his under the table, a silent reminder that they had always known this day would come. They had agreed to be honest with their children when they were old enough to understand, but 9 seemed too young for such heavy truths. "Tommy's father is wrong," Michael said carefully. "I'm exactly who I've always been, your father, a lawyer and someone who believes that people can change if they're willing to work for it. But what if he's right?" Maria pressed her chest intuition, sensing the deeper currents beneath her father's words. Michael looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the future he had fought so hard to secure. "Then I would tell you that where we come from doesn't matter as much as where we're going. And that the most important thing any of us can do is choose to be better than we were yesterday." Maria seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to her dinner with the easy acceptance of childhood. But Michael knew that harder questions would come as she grew older, and he would have to find ways to explain the choices he had made without burdening her with the full weight of his past. After the children were in bed, Michael and Elizabeth sat on their back porch, watching the lights of Manhattan twinkle across the East River. It was a view that never failed to remind Michael of how far he had traveled from the world of his youth. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked, a question she had never posed in all their years together. "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it. The choice to leave, the choice to testify, the choice to build this life." Michael considered the question, thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. He thought about his father, who had died alone in prison but had found redemption in his final act of love. He thought about his mother, whose memory had guided every major decision he had made since her death. He thought about the clients he had helped, the families he had saved, and the children sleeping upstairs who would never know the fear that had once defined his existence. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret any of it. The pain, the guilt, the loss, it was all necessary to get here, to become who I needed to be." "And who is that?" Michael smiled, taking his wife's hand in his. "A man who broke the cycle. A father who gave his children a different legacy. Someone who learned that redemption isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing to create a better future." As they sat in comfortable silence, Michael reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from the violent world of organized crime to the peaceful domesticity of suburban family life. He had paid a heavy price for his freedom, the loss of his father, the destruction of his family's empire, and the constant weight of knowing that his choices had sent dozens of people to prison. But he had also gained something invaluable, the knowledge that change was possible, that love could triumph over loyalty, and that even the darkest legacy could be transformed into something beautiful. The Torino name was buried with Vincent, but the Torre's name would live on in his children and their children, carrying forward not the weight of blood and violence, but the promise of justice and redemption. Michael Torres had broken free from his father's legacy, but more importantly, he had created a new one, a legacy of hope, integrity, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved a second chance. In the distance, the city continued its relentless motion, indifferent to the small victories and quiet redemptions that played out in its shadows. But for Michael Torres, sitting on his porch with his wife beside him and his children safe in their beds, the city's indifference no longer mattered. He had found his peace, and in doing so, he had ensured that his children would never have to search for theirs. The story of the Torino family had ended in violence and betrayal, but the story of the Torres family was just beginning, and it would be written in love, hope, and the endless possibility of redemption.